Last summer, I was asleep in my childhood bedroom, visiting my family in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when the tornado sirens woke me up. Let me pause and tell you that this is a story that turns out with everyone safe, and a natural disaster that was not, thank God, too imminently disastrous. And let me tell you also that waking up to tornado sirens was not at all shocking to me. I grew up in Tulsa. So it was with sleepy, wary curiosity that I climbed out of bed that night and made my way to the porch to see what was going on. Did I mention I'm from Tulsa? I think we are renowned for heading for the porch. At first, all I noticed was an ominous stillness. It was too dark to see that signature green sky, but the air felt very heavy in the way severe Oklahoma weather can. My dad joined me on the porch, and we peered out into the night. Then the winds started to pick up, and the trees started to look like pom-poms in the hands of a very enthusiastic cheerleader, rubbing together, flurrying apart. It was very loud. It was too much, perhaps, for even an Oklahoman, so Dad and I headed back inside. By now, my spouse had awakened too, and we conferred. Do we wake up the children, move them somewhere a little more secure? Not yet. They're in an interior room, and there hasn't been a twister spotted. So we stood back a little ways from the window, but still watched the trees bend and flail outside. When the power blinked off, my dad turned on the battery-powered radio. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the oppressive air lifted. The trees calmed themselves like toddlers after a tantrum, and it was over. We all went back to bed relieved. We were in Tulsa, so it could have been so much worse. In the morning, we awoke late to a yard full of branches and leaves and to children's complaints. The TV wouldn't work, and they wanted their Sunday morning cartoons. The next day, my own little family headed for home as planned, leaving my parents and brother powerless in their houses, cooking on little camp stoves, especially the food that would quickly go bad. There hadn't been a tornado that night, but 100-mile-an-hour straight winds had destroyed the power grid in Tulsa and downed countless trees across the city. As the temperatures climbed into the hundreds the following day, it was June in Oklahoma. Most Tulsans remained without power for almost 2 weeks. This is a snapshot of life in climate change. We've always had storms in Tulsa, of course. In fact, we're rather famous for them. But the straight winds were new, and the frequency is increasing. And there are earthquakes now, too, which there never were before due to fracking. And our resilience is cracking a bit after so much extraction. After so long living in an economy that thrived by taking too much from the earth and taking us away from each other. This is a snapshot of life in a changed climate. And it's not what Hollywood predicted. It's not an entire city wiped off the earth in a day or a zombie apocalypse. It's more discrete disasters than before, and it's global pandemic lasting years, and it's a slow, steady rise of disease. It's 2 weeks without power in 100-degree heat. It's deadly, but it's not a melodrama. Deadly, but in the meantime, we live our lives mostly as we have. And maybe it's time we didn't. Maybe it's time we, by which I don't mean simply those in this room, but all of us, got a lot more intentional about the change happening around us and about how we must actively choose to adapt to all that is changing. The thing about times of change is that we can't avoid them. They are. But we can choose how we respond to them. And the thing about this transition is that we can make the changes in our lives and in our communities and in our structures that make this transition more just, or we can simply endure it being more and more unjust. We can't avoid the transition, it's already unfolding, but we can adapt toward what a group of climate justice activists called the movement generation call a just transition. This group, the movement generation, center their work on naming the connections between our extractive economy and the climate disasters that are upon us. They call us to make the transition to regenerative economies as a way to survive, as a way for us to survive the change that's already happening, but as a way that will coincidentally also slow or halt unfolding climate chaos. They point out if we divest ourselves from all of the processes of extractive economies and invest instead in smaller, slower, more regenerative ways of resource distribution, then we are starving those economies that have created such trouble for us while we're building resilient structures to live into all that may come. They call this, in the words of the eco-philosopher Joanna Macy, a great turning. Because the transition is happening either way, but we have the agency to shift it from disastrous to just. The way we do this is by adapting in life-giving ways rather than separating and individualistic and isolating ones. We respond to storms with great networks of neighborliness and care. We use upheavals to point us back to the humanity of each and every person. We preempt further tragedy with more grounded and sustainable ways of being. You know, the day after that Tulsa storm last June, my parents' neighborhood was abuzz with neighbors, checking on each other, commiserating about tree branches, lending a hand, sharing fuel. They were responding in ways that built community further. And they were doing that in part because they already knew each other as neighbors. My parents are lucky that way. But later that week, I also heard of a number of scams in Tulsa related to generators. And I realized that this is the choice we face in this time, between business as usual that deepens the tragedy, or a turn intentionally toward one another to build our relationships and our resilience for what is to come. It's between neighborliness and taking advantage. We could be toppled by the winds of all these storms unfolding, or we could make of ourselves seeds of deeper community and more just, fair interaction with one another, and then allow those seeds to rise up and ride that wind to something better. I want to share with you a framework from the movement generation that I found incredibly helpful in thinking about weathering the storms of climate change. It's a white paper called Shocks and Slides, and they write the following, which I'll quote at some length. Instability has become a defining feature of our times. In many ways, this instability is the new landscape of social struggle. It's useful to classify the economic and ecological disruptions that make up this new normal into two groups, shocks and slides. Shocks, they say, present themselves as acute moments of disruption. These are, for example, market crashes, huge disasters, and uprisings. Those 100-mile-an-hour winds were a shock to Tulsa and its power grid and its people. They write, slides, on the other hand, are incremental by nature. Slides can be catastrophic, but they are not experienced as acute. Sea level rise is a slide. Rising unemployment is a slide. The rising costs of food and energy are a slide. And while they share a set of root causes, the scale, pace, and implications of shocks and slides differ and require different responses from social movements. They write that our key role in social movements must be to harness the shocks and direct the slides, all toward the greatest equity, resilience, and ecological restoration possible. When we put our attention toward harnessing the shocks and directing the slides, they say things begin to shift. Shifts emerge from collective aha moments. When social movements awaken the popular imagination to new possibilities and spark social action, have we seen so much of that in these last 4 years? They write, the coming shocks and slides, if we anticipate and prepare for them properly, can be key opportunities to spark those aha moments. They add shifts also result not only from shocks and slides, but from well-organized communities creating new institutions that meet people's needs during shocks and slides better than the dominant system can, like food sovereignty projects, collectivized housing systems, and cooperative economies like time banks, worker co-ops, food shares, and more. All of those things that can build resilience in the face of shocks and slides. We can build them ahead of time, knowing that those shocks and slides are inevitably going to come. Back to my own words now, we have these storms ahead of us, but we also have a choice ahead of us. To stand out on the porch watching, pretending it can't hurt us, or to make the shifts that will shelter and protect our people and generate a new path. Maybe even to toss out some seeds of better ideas than the status quo that can ride those winds to a different way of being. We can shift things. We can harness the shocks and guide the slides when we are prepared to respond rather than simply react, when we are centered and very grounded in our values, and when we've practiced adapting in smaller stakes ways in our communities. The thing I've noticed about climate disasters and also during social movements is that the communities who have already been embedded in deep connection with each other and have already been practicing their values together, they have a lot easier time pivoting and responding well instead of reacting with panic and emerging from the shock with their core values still intact. Whereas folks who haven't been building that muscle find it a lot harder to do anything other than react in ways that may or may not reflect their values, which can sometimes lead us coming out the other side of a shock, realizing we've not behaved as we intended. When we're always working on shifting the slides and always practicing deep community with each other, then we are more prepared to harness the shocks when they inevitably come. This is why I believe that places like the UU Church of Columbia can be, if we put our hearts to it, prime locations of climate resilience in our society. Because we are already here, every week, practicing our values together, building the connections that will sustain us, bringing our mission of courageous love to live inside our bones so that it doesn't desert us when the storms arrive. We practice sharing with one another generously here so that when a storm comes, we're ready to share with our neighbors and build a deeper connection. We have the tools here that we need to become responsive rather than reactive as a community. We have the deep spiritual practice that can allow us to feel grounded and centered because we've practiced it every week or every day in preparation. And we've got all the relational values of covenant and restoring relationship when it's been harmed and remembering human dignity that we will need to root down and ride out the storms together in a way that makes space for something more just. We can practice now, turning to our neighbors, depending on one another in some of the ways we will need to in the days ahead. We can choose in our community to depend on one another, so we're ready to do that better more broadly in the days ahead. We can practice now guiding our systems towards more humane distributions of resources amid the slides of economic and ecologic suffering. We do that every time we show up at City Hall to ask for something better, every time we sign a petition to get something on our state ballot, every time we advocate to our national governments. We can also build resilient, regenerative, alternate systems now, time banks and food shares and clothing swaps. And we have a group called the Climate Resilience Group that is working to think about and plan some of these things. We can be, I believe, one influence among the many it will take to harness the shocks and direct the slides to a more just version of the transition that we are all facing. We can practice circling up now, so that when the wind comes blowing in hard, we are ready to rise, ready to ride, and ready to keep the circle whole.